Hello and welcome to The Rest is Politics US and this special series that we are doing on how Trump won the White House in 2016. Going back in history, having a little PTSD on both sides here as a reporter and as a campaign strategist. And this is episode 2. And Anthony and I are going to look at the team that Trump created. Now he's secured the candidacy and secured the nomination and the strategy that they implemented in that team. And then in the second half, we're going to take a quick look at the opposing side, because remember, this was also an open primary process on the Democratic side. And there's an incredibly exciting race that was happening between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And we're going to look at where they both stood at the beginning of this campaign. Let's dive into the Trump team, Anthony. He's secured the nomination and he has been building during the primary, a team around him. And I think it's worth looking at some of these characters because they are also going to dictate how he messages, how he does the strategy, how he uses Twitter, and how he manages ultimately to secure the White House. And one of the people I think that is worth looking at, you've spoken about Corey Lewandowski a bit in the last episode, but explain a little bit more his role in the campaign and how he was the figure that Donald Trump really needed, because he was kind of Donald Trump's yes man. He was the one that always said yes to him. Donald Trump didn't like having people say no to him. Corey Lewandowski, who was a little bit of a sycophant from my point of view, reporting on this, he seemed like a little bit of a sycophant. But how important was he in building the strategy?
I guess maybe because I have a fondness for Corey, I don't see him as much as a sycophant as I saw him as somebody that knew the nature of his boss. And he had a job to do, which was to get the guy elected, which was going to help him with his political bona fides. But I get the point. As a journalist, I could see what you mean. But Corey was doing a lot of things right, but there was something going wrong between him and the family. And I don't know exactly what it was because I wasn't close enough to the campaign until I got in there in May. But there were sore feelings between the Trump children and Jared Kushner and Corey. And that strain led to Corey's ejection from the campaign, and he was replaced by Paul Manafort. And this happened probably mid-May to June of 2016. And so what's interesting about all of that is I didn't know these people. And so you have to imagine I come into the campaign, I meet with Donald Trump, we show him a PowerPoint presentation, which is the Romney fundraising strategy. I'm with Senator Scott Brown, and Trump says to me, "Do you want to be my campaign finance chair?" And I look at him and I say, "Well, I'm hosting Wall Street Week for the Fox Business Channel. I don't want to be your campaign finance chair. I'll have to give up that post." He then says to me, "Well, what about Steven Mnuchin? Do you know him?" I said, "Yes, I know Steven well. We worked together at Goldman Sachs. He's a great guy. Yes, I did a hotel deal with him in Hawaii. I'm going to call him and make him my campaign finance chair." Why is this important? Because Steve is coming to play. He's a former Goldman Sachs partner. He's a hedge fund manager. He's a Hollywood movie producer. He's never really been in politics before, but him and Donald Trump get on with each other. They understand each other, and Steve's coming to play. And so I meet with Steve with the Romney list, and we're going to do our first fundraiser, which is late May in 2016. And why is this important? Because we're now trying to do the Romney thing. It doesn't work, by the way, Katty. We can get into that later. But so Corey's still on the campaign. He's been wounded by the kids. Steve enters as the campaign finance chair. I'm on the committee, which allows me to keep my job at Fox. And we're working, but Trump is nervous. He's been told by people he's got the nomination, but he may get bamboozled by the establishment Republicans at the convention. And that's how Paul Manafort ends up on the scene.
So tell us a little bit about Paul Manafort, who had been a kind of lobbyist, political operative, gets brought in to replace Corey Lewandowski as campaign chair, manager of the campaign. What's his relationship with Donald Trump? I mean, I know it ends up trickily, but what was his relationship with Donald Trump at the time? And why did Donald think that Paul was the guy to run his campaign?
So Donald Trump has this love affair, hate affair with Roger Stone. And for those people that are listening, and who is Roger Stone? He's a very famous, hard-knuckled, hardball political strategist, political consultant to campaigns for the Republican Party. He has always said that Donald Trump should run for office. And Trump likes him and dislikes him. He's been fired by Trump and rehired by Trump probably 6 or 7 times. This is why the Lewandowski situation is so interesting, because it's like a revolving door with Trump.
Roger Stone, by the way, famously loved Richard Nixon so much that he has a tattoo of him on his back.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if he's added a tattoo of Donald Trump to that, but he's got a tattoo of Richard Nixon.
I'm not sure, but I'm trying not to vomit during this episode. So
Anthony Scaramucci does not have a tattoo of Donald Trump.
I don't have a Donald Trump tattoo, but by the way, I'm just trying to not think of Roger Stone with his shirt off, to be honest. But anyway, he has a lobbying in the 80s and 90s. It's Stone, Manafort, and a few other people. So Trump knows Manafort. He knows Manafort through Stone. He also knows Manafort through Roy Cohn, his former attorney, who he says is his big mentor, who's sort of a ruthless guy. But Manafort doesn't have ruthless qualities like that. He's sort of more of a more subtle guy. He's a very well manicured guy. He's very well dressed. I meet him for the first time in the lobby of the 26th floor at Trump Tower. He says, "Anthony, I see you on TV." We start to commiserate a little bit. It turns out he's from an Italian-American community in Connecticut. There's very large Italian-American immigration up there. I think his last name was Manaforte. He shortened it and anglicized it to Manafort. We get on quite well. He's now going to run the campaign. He invites me to this evangelical event at the Marriott Marquis Hotel, where Trump is going to be introduced by Jerry Falwell Jr. to these Christian evangelicals, and we're all backstage together. And Trump is not really that Christian, and Trump hasn't really lived that Christian of a life. But for whatever reason, Katty, he's got them eating out of his hand. And Manafort likes this.
He was famously asked which his favorite book of the Bible was, and he couldn't come up with a single one.
Well, but he said all of them. He said, no, all of them. Okay. I mean, literally, you got to laugh because it's so effective, even though it's so transparently obvious what he's doing. And so Manafort and I get on. We're going to have a big fundraiser. We're going to go to Tom Barrack's house. He's friends with Trump. They've done some real estate deals together. He has a beautiful mansion in Brentwood. We're going to get Wolfgang Puck to cook the meal for us, but we're going to make a stop in Albuquerque, New Mexico before we do this. And so now this is my first trip on the Trump plane. My old boss, Lou Eisenberg, who had worked for Jeb Bush, I call him. He's a former Goldman Sachs partner. I say, Lou, I know you're not with Trump, but you got to be on the plane with me. I've invited you on the plane. Fly out to the fundraiser. Fly out to New Mexico with me. I have pictures on my phone. Maybe we can put them up on the website of our podcast. So just quickly, we're on the plane. We go to New Mexico. Eisenberg and I are overwhelmed by the crowd size. Can't believe how big it is. Trump has a message that's unique to the Republicans. We end up at the fundraiser. It's a very big fundraiser. And now we're flying back. Manafort and I are flying back together from L.A., and we're feeling pretty good about ourselves. This is late May of 2016.
So we're starting to build the team around Donald Trump. But of course, there's one person that's missing, and that is the vice presidential pick. A very big moment for any campaign. It's when you reveal who you have chosen. There's a whole big debate about, do you choose somebody because they're going to win you a state? Do you choose somebody because they're going to win you a demographic group? All of these discussions are going on in the Trump campaign, and they decide on picking Mike Pence, who is the governor of Indiana. It's a surprising pick. I remember reporting on this because the other names that were out there were Newt Gingrich, who had been involved in the Republican Party in the 1990s and was a very big figure in the Republican Party, and Chris Christie, who we mentioned before, who had run in the primary, governor of New Jersey. And he was also a sort of a big force in a little Trumpian in his style, Chris Christie. And he was always also a name that was being floated out there. But the polls had suggested that Donald Trump needed some support amongst the evangelical community, needed some support in the Midwest. And he went for Mike Pence, who is a conservative, very evangelical Christian, an important demographic group that Trump, as you were just saying, speaking at a Christian group, not necessarily the most Christian guy, but he realized as part of his bid to win the presidency, that he was going to have to get evangelicals with him, despite the fact that he'd been through multiple divorces, spoke about women in perhaps not the most polite way. So he chooses Mike Pence and he unveils him. He's not a particularly charismatic figure. He's definitely not somebody who's going to overshadow Donald Trump. He's anti-abortion. He's pro-gun rights. His career, by the way, in Indiana is not going terribly well, which may be one of the reasons why Mike Pence makes also the improbable decision to go with Donald Trump. I mean, these two characters are so different. And Mike Pence's wife, also very Christian, also very Midwest nice. And yet they kind of attach their wagon in the way that you've talked about during this series to Donald Trump, who is sort of the antithesis of everything they represent. And I remember the first time they come on stage together thinking this does not look like a marriage made in heaven. These two people look like they've come from totally different backgrounds, which they have. They had totally different styles. But I guess from the campaign's point of view, when you were discussing who would be the best candidate, the decision was really just Mike Pence because of the evangelicals, because of the Midwest, because he had that kind of nice demeanor about him that perhaps Republicans who, as we said in the last episode, didn't like Donald Trump's character could take some reassurance from Mike Pence. Is that why? Do you think they chose him?
Yes, I do think that. And I would just add to this, there were three people that understood Donald Trump better than the other people, myself included. It was Mike Pence, Stephen Mnuchin, and Mike Pompeo.
Mike Pompeo, who was the former Secretary of State who became the former Secretary of State, was a congressman at the time.
Correct. Yeah, he was CIA director, then he became Secretary of State. But why is this important? Those guys actually understood that they needed to be as far away from the Trump show as possible. Trump was a team of one. He was a one-man show. There are no second actors on stage. There are no accessory actors, no supporting roles. And they understood that. Steve Bannon didn't understand that. Frankly, I missed that. There were many others that missed that. But Pence did a very good job over the course of the campaign and as vice president of taking a second fiddle. Let me restate that. Not even a second fiddle, Katty, a 29th fiddle to Donald Trump.
He was off in the wings somewhere of the orchestra.
It was very important. And you know, Pompeo said something. If he's listening, he's going to be mad at me for repeating it, but it's actually funny. So, Mike, don't be mad at me. Mike once said, if he calls you President Pompeo, it's time as Secretary of State to book a trip to like Antarctica and see if we can reignite our diplomatic relationship with the Penguins. You know, meaning anytime he said, you're getting more famous than me, or what are you, President Katty K? The minute he says that, you got to run for the woods. And people that didn't usually got neutralized by him. But Pence was really good at understanding that.
So Mike Pence is chosen. He's officially announced, walks out on that stage when I said it was all seemed kind of awkward. They were not the same type of person, chalk and cheese. That's the 15th of July. And 3 days later, we get into the Republican National Convention. And I think this is the moment where Donald Trump's strategy and his message coalesce. And we, as reporters, I was up there in Cleveland, Ohio for that convention, we start to get a sense of what this campaign is going to look like. There's two parts to it. One is the way that convention articulated Donald Trump, and it was particularly aggressive as a convention. I remember walking through the car park and there are these people in jumpsuits with a mask of Hillary Clinton on their face. And Lock Her Up became one of the themes of that convention, with these incredible Trump supporters shouting about, you know, Hillary Clinton should be prosecuted. She has to go to jail. They really hated Hillary Clinton. And the strategy also kind of coalesced with that, and I think became clear around that time of the convention. And that the tone of that convention and when Chris Christie stood up on the stage and did a mock prosecution of Hillary Clinton. Again, it was another moment where everyone was shocked. This hadn't really been done in conventions before. There was a misogynist way that they spoke about Hillary Clinton, these people in jumpsuits around the stage, the chants of lock her up. But that message and that tone turned out to be very popular with the base. When you were planning that convention, you were at the convention as well on the Republican side, Anthony. Did that tone of the convention, was that a deliberate strategy, do you think, on the part of the campaign? Did they want that to be a shocking convention? Because that's, from our point of view, covering it, it was kind of a shocking event.
So I think so, yes, Katty, because Trump wanted to make a big stance. Trump wanted shock and awe. Trump understood the more media attention, the better for him. The more people talking about him, pluses or minuses, the better for him. And I will say this, and again, Reince Priebus did a very good job of organizing that convention. It was infused with lots of Trumpism, but Priebus did a very good job of organizing the delegates. He organized the whole package, if you will, the presentation. He made it very easy for the Trump campaign. It was a plug and play for whoever the nominee was going to be. And then the second thing I would say about it, which I found to be very interesting about Trump at the convention, slightly nervous. And you often see him nervous. He was slightly nervous.
Interesting.
The night before he was going to give a speech, I was live on Cavuto's show on Fox News. So it was the night before the speech, the Thursday, and there was a band playing. They were doing like a tune-up. It was like 4:00 in the afternoon. I'm on with Cavuto. Trump is watching from his hotel suite, and I say something he doesn't like. And so I'm coming off of the thing, and the phone is ringing, and it's Trump, and he's agitated at me, telling me, no, you can't say it that way. You have to say it this way. And I have to say, I have to be honest with you, Mr. Trump, I couldn't hear him. I had the earpiece in, but there was a band playing behind me. I don't know if you heard the band, but I didn't hear the question, so I gave a more generic answer than I should have. Oh, okay. And he hung up. But it was a sign that he was agitated, and it was a sign that he was working himself up to that speech. That was an important moment for him. And if you go back to that speech, he doesn't typically do this, but he had some sweat on his face. He had some sweat on his mustache and so forth. He was worked up for that speech.
I remember mostly about that speech was the setting, Anthony. And all of us watching as he kind of walks on stage. My memory was that he was almost in silhouette, right?
Yeah, the shadow.
It's so dramatic. There's this kind of shadow of Donald Trump walks on stage. There's the smoke. There's the columns behind him. I mean, the grandiosity of it is almost kind of, classic Greek Empire. He wanted to build the imagery was this big guy who walked out of the kind of shadows and suddenly was revealed with the spotlight on him as Donald Trump. And it was almost funny. It was kind of the show. It was the Trump show, and he was the kind of leading role, and it looked sort of kind of hysterical.
Lots to be said there about Mark Burnett and the influence of reality television in terms of the way they produced that.
So the reason I was saying that the message and the strategy combined, and we got the sense of it at that convention, was that there was a lot of influence on the convention about America first. That became the mantra of Donald Trump and became the mantra of his campaign. And this idea of the forgotten men and women of America who had been screwed by globalization, had been left behind. There was no safety net for them. And it was a protectionist, anti-globalization economic policy, very different, by the way, from the Republicans' traditional policies, which had been free trade, pro-globalization. And he comes in with this message that is very targeted at white, non-college educated, working class Americans, particularly those Americans who worked in manufacturing. And where are those manufacturing bases? They are in the blue wall of the Democrats' stronghold. States like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, we still talk about them. The states that we are still talking about in the 2024 campaign, Ohio. And Donald Trump figured out that if he could push this America First message of globalization has screwed America, and it has screwed you, the American public, and you, the American worker, and all of these jobs that have gone off to China. So it was, again, this anti-foreigner thing. And we heard it repeatedly during the course of the campaign. And of course, that then became the strategy. They decided they were going to attack the blue wall. improbable though it seemed, because this was such a Democratic stronghold. This is where the unions were strong. This is where the Democrats have been strong. But I remember after that convention going to a small town in Ohio that had had a huge steel mill. It was known as Steel Town, that had employed something like 5,000 people and now only employed 250 people. And I interviewed a guy who had been a lifelong Democrat, lifelong union worker, and for the very first time in his life, he was switching parties after that convention because he listened to that convention and he was going to switch parties and vote for Donald Trump. And this guy knew more about WTO, World Trade Organization regulations, and more about China and offshoring than is probably good for most people. But he was convinced that the Democrats had done nothing for his town, that while they'd all voted Democrats, the steel mills had shut, and that here was somebody, and he'd been kind of blown away by the convention. And I remember asking him, but what do you think of Donald Trump's character? And he was one of those people who said to me, I don't really like him. I don't like the way he talks about women in particular. This guy was very fond of his wife and his daughter, but I'm desperate. I have to vote for my family and I have to vote for my job. And that was where the strategy and the messaging all, for me, seemed to coalesce. And then you had it being amplified by all of the media outlets, the right-wing media outlets. He amplified it on Twitter. He amplified it on Fox News. But in many ways, and I remember writing this at the time, 2016 for me was a class election. It was about Donald Trump appealing directly to working class American voters who had been hurt by the financial crash of 2008, who'd been hurt by offshoring. And they became essential to his victory. And in that way, he flipped the script. He took those Democratic voters and he put them in the Republican camp. And it was a deliberate strategy.
The only thing I want to add is that he went to these states. He traveled in these states. He was repetitive. We're going back to Michigan. We're going to Wisconsin. Let's go back to Pennsylvania. Can we make it back to Pennsylvania? We're in New Hampshire. Can we make it back to Pennsylvania? And while he was doing that, the other side wasn't doing that.
He was working incredibly hard. I mean, to give Donald Trump his due, right?
He was. Katty, someone will someday have to explain what happened on the other side. They either took it for granted that the blue wall was going to stay blue, and Secretary Clinton did not need to travel there. She didn't go to Wisconsin one time after her convention in Philadelphia. So I don't know why that happened, but I can remember us being very surprised on the campaign.
This was an open primary on the Democratic side. Barack Obama had done his 2 terms in office, and now the Democrats also have to choose their candidate for the presidency. As we all know, Hillary Clinton ends up winning the Democratic nomination, but it's worth pointing out that there was a bitter fight in the Democratic Party between Hillary Clinton, who'd been the Secretary of State, and Bernie Sanders, who was the senator from Vermont. And in many ways, it felt to me reporting on this that Bernie Sanders, who described himself as a democratic socialist, very much on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, fought for issues like income inequality. He wanted universal health care, which America doesn't have. He wanted free public college tuition. This was a big deal for him. He wanted free tertiary education for people, campaign finance reform, so to punish Wall Street and the big banks. And his campaign became incredibly popular with young American voters who felt disillusioned, who felt they'd been left behind, who didn't feel they had many opportunities. And the kind of paradox of it all was, there are 2 paradoxes. One was that Bernie Sanders was the most unlikely person to appeal to young voters. He was a grumpy old white guy. I mean, let's make no bones about it. He was a grumpy old white guy who got this army of Bernie supporters who would go around saying, feel the burn. And his rallies, they were devotees. I remember my 30-year-old son in that election saying to me, Bernie Sanders is the one for us. Bernie Sanders is the one for young people. And the other paradox of him is that he's kind of saying the same things that Donald Trump is saying. He is a populist on the left in the way that Donald Trump is a populist on the right. He's not anti-immigrant. He's not nativist, although he doesn't do very well in the primaries with immigrant voters. He doesn't do very well with Hispanic voters, and he doesn't do particularly well with Black voters, which was one of his big weaknesses. But in terms of class, if we're thinking of this as a class election, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, they're more similar than they might like to think, either of them.
Well, I mean, listen, Corey, if we can get Corey on as a guest, he would tell you that he used to go to, Corey Lewandowski used to go to Bernie Sanders rallies because he said there was more or less the same people that were listening to the same grievance. And so here's the grievance quickly, Katty. The grievance is we once lived in an aspirational blue-collar America. And frankly, that's the America I grew up in. My dad was a crane operator, but he was going to work hard. He was going to have a living wage. The wages were going to be enough to sustain his children into college. And one of his children were to go on to live the American dream, if not all of them. Those very same people who were once economically aspirational have felt economically desperational now. And so I'm going to indict both parties with this. It was offshoring of the manufacturing. It was the signing of NAFTA, where 65,000 factories left the United States. And all of these Rust Belt areas got hollowed out. And in comes Bernie Sanders with his message, or Donald Trump with his message. You're the forgotten men and women of our country, and I'm here to be your advocate. I'm here to be the avatar for your anger. And so Trump and Sanders have things in common more than they would like to admit. And of course, 12% of the Sanders voters go on to vote for Donald Trump on election day, November of 2016.
Which may have been a big problem for Hillary Clinton. So the Democratic race kicks off. It's very exciting. And Hillary Clinton is the establishment candidate with a lot of money, an extraordinary infrastructure around the country. And I think all of our assumption, a bit like we'd assumed that Jeb Bush was going to be the candidate on the Republican side. We spoke about that in the last episode. Watching it, everyone assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to cruise to victory. But she goes into the Iowa caucuses and she wins by a tiny fraction. Hillary Clinton gets 49.8%. Bernie Sanders gets 49.6%. Some of the counties in Iowa, by the way, it was so close that they had to toss a coin to determine who was going to win. And then they go into the New Hampshire primary 8 days later, and Bernie Sanders absolutely crushes Hillary Clinton. And I think that was the first time we all woke up to the fact that he was going to be a real challenger to her, and that they were going to have a battle on their hands. Clinton wins the next few primaries, sweeps into Super Tuesday, and it puts her in a good position. But then Hillary Clinton loses Michigan. And I think that is a critical moment, not because of the primary, which Hillary Clinton goes on to wrap up, because of what it foretells about the November general election. And that losing Michigan was going to be exactly as Donald Trump had predicted. He could smash the blue wall. And losing that Michigan primary to Bernie Sanders, I think, was the first time we all kind of thought, wow, this is not just about this Democratic primary, but there is something going on in these blue wall states that Hillary Clinton has not managed to capture. And so she kind of tries after that to move to the left, but it doesn't really work very well because it seems inauthentic. And I think that was, I don't know what it felt like from the campaign's point of view, watching Hillary Clinton try to reinvent herself in order to capture some of those Bernie Sanders magic. But it just seemed like she was almost willing to do anything to be president.
Okay, so let me ask you a question, if you don't mind. Bill Clinton, is he a retail politician? Yes or no?
Yes, absolutely. One of the best retail politicians America's had.
Vice President Al Gore, retail politician?
No.
Okay. What about Jeb Bush, retail politician?
No.
Okay. But if I say Donald Trump, retail politician?
Absolutely. Great.
Okay. And so you know right away in your mind when someone's connecting to people or not connecting to people. Again, you may not like their policies, but what Secretary Clinton did not have was she was over-calculating everything. Okay, one of the reasons why I've gotten in trouble my whole life is I undercalculate everything, Katty K, and I just say whatever the hell's on my mind.
We're working on that, Anthony, a little bit.
That's why they team me up with you. Okay, I know you have a whistle in there somewhere. You're going to blow it on me at one point. But my point is, she was so tight, and that there was no opportunity for her to release anything. She could have been a great president, perhaps. She's certainly talented. She's very well qualified. She had an unbelievable resume, but you have to win the presidency to be president. And unfortunately, to win the presidency, you have to win over your fellow Americans. You have to be popular with them. And this is something that Barack Obama's not going to like, but I've heard he doesn't listen to our podcast, so I'm just going to tell you what it is. He created Donald Trump because he lit him up at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and then he told Joe Biden, hey, man, you got to take a powder. I cut a deal with the Clintons in 2012 for their big-time endorsement and their speeches at the convention, and I said I would support them. You got to take a powder. You can't run for president. And, of course, Biden went on a 40-minute soliloquy in the Rose Garden, but he desperately wanted to go and run for president in 2016, and perhaps he would have beat her in the primaries and slayed Donald Trump in 2016 as opposed to waiting to 2020. So you have an unretail politician running against a populist maverick. What a recipe.
And at one point during the campaign, Joe Biden actually in public calls out the Clinton campaign for ignoring white working class voters, because what Hillary Clinton is trying to do is recreate the Obama coalition. She realizes that there is a working class problem. She tries to do these shifts to the left with some of her policy issues. She commits to being opposed to more trade agreements. She makes a commitment on the minimum wage to raise the minimum wage. She pushes for more expanded American healthcare. She speaks about bringing the banks in line. But the trouble is it just doesn't ring true because those haven't been her policies beforehand. And what she's trying to do is get a lot of women to vote for her. And in some ways, being a woman and the first woman, she spoke about it a lot. She spoke about, in a way that we are not hearing Kamala Harris do, by the way. She spoke about smashing the glass ceiling. She spoke about her daughter. She spoke about all the women who had come before her. And there was, to the extent that there was genuine excitement around Hillary Clinton, I think it was just this idea that she could be the first female president. It wasn't really about her necessarily. It was much more about America could take this step of having had a black president and then having a woman president. And I think the Clinton campaign's mistake was thinking that there was a linear progression in American society that would show that they had moved kind of to the left. They would elect a black president, and the next thing they would do was elect a female president. Now, she would say that that was one of her biggest hurdles and that there was a lot of sexism in the campaign, which there was. We saw those, I remember walking through Washington Reagan Airport going off on one of my campaign trips, and there were these nutcrackers in the shape of Hillary Clinton. And the message, they're selling this in the airport, the idea that she's a ball breaker, that somehow she's anti-feminine or that she's tough on men. And there was all these questions about her pantsuits and what she wore. But I mean, I think in a way, weirdly, that was her campaign.
So the fact that I had one on my bookcase, is that something you would judge?
I would never
I'm kidding.
judge
I'm
you.
kidding. I didn't have one. I didn't have one of those.
Of
I'm kidding.
course you didn't have one.
No, I remember the damn thing.
Your wife would have divorced you if you'd had one. She was
No, trust me. We came very close during the Trump days. Okay, trust me. So let's go back to this because this is super important. When she's relaxed, she tells people something that nobody wants to hear. And so she's before a group of high-heeled donors at a posh party, and she says 47% of the country are deplorable. 47% of the country don't understand what is going on, and she basically describes them as knuckle draggers. And they catch it on tape, and they play it, and it whips around the country. Did that help her, Katty K?
No, so that gets to the idea that a lot of Americans have felt, which is that the Democratic Party is becoming increasingly elitist, is sneering at people in middle America, as you like to call it. Not only do they not have the policies that protect those people, but that they're snooty about them, that they dismiss them, that they look down on them, and calling them deplorables. I think there were a couple of moments in the campaign, and we can talk about those, but there are a couple of moments in the campaign where, having won the nomination, Hillary Clinton did herself in. And that moment where she refers to Donald Trump supporters as deplorables is certainly one of those. Do you think that campaign with Bernie Sanders, the fact that it dragged on so long, much longer than Hillary thought it was going to do, and the nature of the campaign damaged her as a candidate ultimately?
Yes, I do think that. And I think that she needed to do something that politicians hate to do. And that is she needed to bring him on board. And in 1980, Teddy Kennedy ran against the sitting president, Jimmy Carter, and he came close to beating him. When it was time to bring Teddy Kennedy on board, Carter was willing to do it, but Teddy Kennedy wasn't willing to do it. And they sort of snubbed each other at the 1980 Democratic Convention, and it cost Jimmy Carter. And the same sort of thing happened to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. She couldn't find the right movement on the Rubik's Cube to get the colors to match up between her and Bernie Sanders, and a result of which she was hurt by that. And she didn't consolidate the Democratic Party to the extent she needed to win that election.
We spoke earlier about the Republican National Convention and the tone of that convention. And yes, there were people in that convention who didn't really like Donald Trump. There was some opposition to him. They felt he'd captured the Republican Party, some of the old guard. But it's worth also speaking about the Democratic National Convention, because I think this is where you really see the damage that the primary has done to her. So it's the end of July of 2016, and the Democrats hold their convention in Philadelphia. I went to that having been to the Republican one, and everybody is very excited on the establishment side of the Democratic Party, because effectively, unlike in the Republican Party, the establishment has won, right? Hillary Clinton, ultimate establishment character. And in this case, she's won the nomination. But Bernie Sanders supporters, and I remember sitting there in the convention hall watching as there was all of this excitement about Hillary Clinton, and she walks out in a white pantsuit onto the stage on the last night of the convention to give her address and accept the nomination, white for women's suffragettes movement. So she's channeling all of that. There's a kind of, I am a female president. She talks about the glass ceiling. But there are supporters of Bernie Sanders in the hall who turn their back on Hillary Clinton.
I saw it. I remember it.
And the visual image of that was a reminder, a kind of indication of, wow, there is trouble here. They're all excited about having their first female candidate. The establishment has won, but there is a big group of her. They hated Hillary Clinton almost with the same intensity that they hated Donald Trump. And I remember speaking to young voters in that campaign who said to me, it's a stitch up. They used backroom methods. They ignored our policies. They were radicals. They were very ideologically radical, and they didn't feel that it had been fair. They didn't feel, and I think this was very important, that they didn't feel it had been fair. And the reason they didn't feel it was fair was because a few days before that convention, WikiLeaks published emails from the Democratic National Committee, which made it seem like the DNC, which is meant to be impartial in the primaries and not weigh in on any candidate, it made it clear that the DNC had actually tipped the scales and they had been in favor of Hillary Clinton. And that is why all of these Bernie Sanders people arrive at this convention just 3 days after these emails have been leaked.
Katty, didn't the DNC chair have to resign? I believe it was
she did.
A woman
Debbie
from Florida, right?
Schultz, who was the congresswoman from Florida, had to resign because these emails showed that she had been so critical of Bernie Sanders. And I think all of that strengthened the idea that it had been a fix. And it's just compare now where we are on both sides. The Republicans have had their convention. And yes, there's been a lot of turmoil, but they've rejected the establishment. They've rejected this notion that some people control politics and access to politics and access to power. They've brought in this guy who is in a way, a revolutionary, a total outsider, who has nothing to do with Washington, no political history whatsoever, and yet he's won the nomination. He's kind of broken the rules. And there is Hillary Clinton, who is the ultimate rules candidate. She's had privileged access to power her whole adult life through her husband, Bill Clinton. And I think that we didn't really appreciate at the time the degree to which this set up two completely opposing views of America and of the campaign.
It's extraordinary because the opportunity was there. She won the popular vote, and we're talking about tens of thousands of votes in the swing state. It's just interesting. And I've said this on the Rest is Politics regular podcast. I want you to imagine Trump in a field 48 hours before the election. He's in a field in a farmland in central Pennsylvania. It's raining. She is in the convention center, where the 76ers play. And she's with Jay-Z and Beyonce and John Bon Jovi and Bruce Springsteen and perhaps even Katty K.
I was there.
Yeah, I'm in a farm field getting rained on. And Trump says her slogan is, I'm with her. He says, but my slogan is, I'm with you. And she's got all the stars and all the elites, whether in Philadelphia, but all you have is me.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you something, whether you like Trump or dislike Trump, it's very powerful imagery for garden variety Pennsylvanians who would have been left out of a concert like that. And they go to the polls and they vote in Donald Trump. And by the way, Joe Biden would have had a whole different set of instincts.
He got this. He understood this.
Yeah, well, he was from Scranton, where my dad grew up, and he had a whole different set of instincts related to those people.
But I think it's worth saying that we are saying all of this with the benefit of hindsight. We've had 8 years to digest what happened in that race. And at that moment in the 2016 campaign, just after Hillary Clinton comes out of the convention, of course, we see the boos and we see the people staging walkouts. But the absolute assumption and the conventional wisdom was that Hillary Clinton was the clear favorite in the presidential race. The Democrats came out of that convention extremely confident that they were going to win. The polling suggested that they were going to win, and nobody could really imagine that this upstart, outsider, brash, rude businessman could possibly go on and win the White House and become president of the United States. So the Democrats felt they had this thing locked up.
Now, just before we go, do you think the Democrats are too cocky now? They were certainly too cocky in 2016. Are they too cocky now?
It's a very good question. Are there parallels in the new energy of the Kamala Harris campaign that compare Kamala Harris to Hillary Clinton back in 2016? My feeling is they've learned a lot from the lesson of that campaign. And one of the things they have learned is not to assume that because she's a woman, she is going to secure all of the female votes necessary to put her into the White House. They're not talking about her being a woman. They're not talking about roles. They're not talking about identity. There's none of that "I'm with her" slogan.
Yeah. Now, listen, I think it's fascinating. But in the next episode of this special episodes about how Trump won the election, we're going to get into the campaign, the actual campaign trail, where he went, what he said, how he said it, how it was rebutted by Secretary Clinton, and what was the mindset of that campaign, and how did Kellyanne Conway, how did Steve Bannon enter that campaign? And we're going to do this every step of the way, and we're going to talk about the different conversations that were being had. And it's just a reminder to people that thought we colluded with the Russians. We couldn't even collude with ourselves, Katty K. So how the hell were we going to collude with the Russians? Okay, but we're going to get into that next episode.
You were there every step of the way on the campaign team. I was there reporting on it. If you can't wait, however, for next week's installment on this extraordinary election campaign to find out how it all went so wrong for Hillary Clinton, thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.
Thank you, guys.